Good afternoon, everybody from Oslo. I would like then to welcome everybody who is joining us today for this webinar on pandemics of yesterday, today and tomorrow. Are we always forgetting a piece of the puzzle? This is the second webinar of a series that is being organized by the Lancet One Health Commission, focusing on One Health and reconnecting for our future. How to put different professions, different research fields working together to obtain goals. And I think this message has been made even more relevant as we are all experiencing this pandemic of COVID-19. I'll shortly get to the introductions, but just a few house rules that everyone should be aware of. When you register for this webinar, you by default agreed that this session is now being recorded. And this is so that we can supply the recording for people who have registered but are unable to attend today, and also to place this recording in a possible future webinar archive where this might be available on the long term. All your microphones and cameras are by default turned off, and they will stay like that for the entire webinar. We will start first with both me and the other speaker. We'll put on a few ideas on the table, perhaps challenge all of you who are listening to us today about thinking about some of these issues. And then we will open up for a question and answers discussion period. You can use the question and answers box in Zoom. So you should have a little button under your screen where you can put on your questions. You can do it by adding your name. You can do it anonymously. And we will try as best as possible within the time frame we have to cover them. So, time to say from Oslo, my name is Carlos das Neves. I'm the Director for Research and Internationalization at the Norwegian Veterinary Institute, and I'm at the same time the President of the Wildlife Disease Association, which gathers different veterinarians, biologists, a lot of different people working with wildlife across all continents. And across the Atlantic,
hi, I'm Peter Daszak from New York. Pleasure to be here. I'm the president of Eco Health Alliance, and I've been working in One Health for many years. And I'm one of the Lancet One Health commissioners. So it's going to be great, interesting to see what questions you come up with today and try and answer them live and straight after our slideshows today. Over to you, Carlos.
Thank you very much. So, me and Peter thought how to best put up a topic where we want you to interact as much as possible. So we came up with the idea to do this a little bit just like when we're writing a scientific paper. And it falls upon me here to start perhaps to put a few introduction ideas on the table, put some hypotheses, challenges all a little. And then I have challenged Peter to bring up with some of the material and methods. He's been doing a lot of work across everywhere in this planet. Put some of the results that we have to perhaps try to help answer some of these questions, and we'll let you, all good people, do the discussion of this paper. So, pandemics is not something new, and we are all aware of that. They have been coming for some time, and they've been recorded throughout history, and I put here some pictures just to illustrate a little of what I'm covering. And here in this one, it goes all the way to the Antonine Plague in the Roman times. But if you've read the history of the Peloponnesian War, there will be a recount of how Athens was dramatically taken by a plague long before, 500 years before Christ. So these things have been with us for a while. And it brings us, of course, then the question and the discussion on how do we handle this? How do we manage? How do we cope with this? And a few weeks ago, I was talking to a colleague of mine, a doctor in Italy, and I put these 3 lines before him. And I will give you a little time as well to read, but he read them through, and he was very eager, very quickly to say, yep, this fits. This is some of the measures we have in place for COVID. But Carlos, you shouldn't say infested areas. It's more correct to say infected. And I would agree with him. The point is that these 3 lines, they weren't made for COVID. They were written in 1348 by the Venetian Republic to try to stop the Black Plague. So my Italian colleague was very quick to say, okay, well, this time we know what we're fighting, but I see that there's not much differences in what we're doing from 700 years ago. We're doing our best, coping with something we were definitely not ready for. And to challenge you a little more, I would put another quote here. And so they died. Great pits were dug and piled deep on the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night. And as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I suppose you will all tell, yeah, this has to be from the Black Plague. And you're right, this is a description from someone that went through the Black Plague and survived. But it would be just as true that the picture to the right corner fits this description. And that picture is not 700 years old. It's not even 7 weeks old. It's just outside New York. So we are indeed facing problems that are old and perhaps using and giving approaches that are also not totally new. But a student asked me the other day, but do we have more viruses now? Is wildlife getting more dangerous? I'll perhaps let Peter later on talk about if we have more viruses or not. But I would definitely argue that wildlife is neither growing up in number, not getting more dangerous. But some things have definitely changed, and perhaps some have not. So I would like to put here on the table a few ideas related to this dynamic aspect of pandemics and emerging diseases. The first one that I suppose everyone can quickly relate to. The map on the top corner from a publication a few years ago in the proceedings shows how the Black Plague took 1 to 2 years to develop in the Far East Asia, more than 10 years to cross Eurasia. And when it reached Europe, a very globalized medieval Europe, it took 3 years to cover the entire continent. I guess you know the graph on the bottom corner, that's COVID. It has taken 4 months. And it's not difficult to realize that the virus is not speeding up, but people definitely are. So what about this dynamic between people, viruses, animals? What else is changing? And a few more hints. Of course, population size is definitely changing. And we see now an exponential growth just past the 7 billion mark, and it keeps going. We see climate changing considerably just over the last 200 years. But climate change, which has been a topic now on the constant agenda. And if you want to go back to the wildlife and the importance of wildlife in all of these diseases, what we are actually experiencing is that areas where wildlife were perhaps abundant, forest covered areas, have been reducing, they continue to reduce, and there is a reduction on wildlife, abundancy and diversity. So I would argue with my student that we don't have more wildlife, but the one we have is getting more and more encroached in small areas, and we are perhaps more and more getting in touch with them, perhaps in ways we shouldn't. But not all changes are bad. And these are two pictures that I borrowed from one publication and actually from our colleagues in the Netherlands to show that some things have changed for the better. And one of them is science. We know, of course, a lot more today than 700 years ago. That is just a graph showing the interlinks between pathogens and how they will spill over depending on the contacts between mammals. So we are learning a lot about how infectious agents interact with humans, with other hosts, how they transmit, how they can be fought. And that's something that makes a difference. What also makes a difference, or would make a difference if we truly engage in this concept, is the One Health approach. And that's what our Dutch colleagues have, I think, very, very well put on this picture. How animals, the humans sharing an environment, are all an ecosystem, and how things that we do affect each other, and how all of these together affect as well the dynamic of viruses, bacteria, different pathogens. And here the importance is to understand how changes in each sector of this nice figure can impact the entire figure. So some changes are for the best. And even COVID, I would argue, has brought another change. And this I found the other day, a very nice adaptation by Sara Carnevale of a very famous painting, which this was about the tsunami of publications. And COVID has indeed made a change for science, I would argue. It has got us working together as perhaps never before. And here are just two examples of two very large websites, one from the Johns Hopkins and the other put together by the Allen Institute, which are collecting more thousands and thousands of publications many of these things being put open access, data being shared. So we have speeded up the way we work trying to solve this problem. So we have changed. But let me also now say, sometimes perhaps we haven't changed. And some of this can be troubling. Let me challenge you with this picture. This is just a graph from Google showing how much the word pandemic has been Googled. And for those of us working in infectious diseases, you will probably recognize these two little peaks. Everyone knows this one here, of course, but some of you will perhaps identify these peaks here. And they are, of course, H5N1 and the very famous swine influenza. So when this pandemic hits, we Googled for pandemics, and quickly enough, the interest faded away. And while, of course, COVID this is a 100% increase, that's what the scale means, in search, in the last 3 weeks, it has decreased already 50%. And I'm always reminded by an ancient professor of mine that told me, when society loses interest, politicians lose interest, funding agencies will fade away within the month. So how do we keep the interests, not during the peaks, but in this long period in between? How do we engage society so we don't lose the political will and we don't lose the financial will that is needed to fight these pandemics? And that takes me to the last, perhaps unchanged thing I would like to challenge us all to think. When we go to university, those of us working in this field, we learn that this is the way you work. You try to predict, forecast what might happen. You do your best to prevent it. But if you're not able, of course, you should detect it quickly and you should respond and solve the problem. So this is how we're told we should work. But if I put here this, I would actually argue that COVID, like perhaps many other pandemics, is still working backwards. We have been hit by something that most were perhaps not ready for. And this is just a few examples to illustrate people working at the different stages. Of course, WHO has now been putting a world response, trying to manage a situation that has spread quickly. A lot of governments and international authorities have now engaged in detection. We are all aware of the test discussion. Do we have enough tests? Do we need better tests? And at the end of the scale, of course, prevention. I put two pictures that illustrate the two things that have been mostly discussed. Wash your hands, wash your fingers, and then cross your fingers for a vaccine to come up quickly. That's why I put CEPI, one of the big platforms working. And needless to say that there is no much prediction to do because it has already hit us. But what would have been the impact of working the other way around? I mean, you all probably are familiar with these institutions. How many will know the Global Virome Project? I guess Peter will talk a little about this, so I won't go into that. But an idea to predict better what might hit us so that we have time to wash our hands, to develop vaccines, to have good tests so that the response is little. And I would argue that yes, prediction costs millions, and we'll be telling you it costs millions, but it might save us billions. And I fear that right now we are already spending billions because we risk losing trillions. So the magnitude has changed. That said, and to end my part of this putting up arguments with a positive tone, perhaps here along this scale, we also see a difference. And I'm very happy to see that WHO has led just now in February, put together a lot of people around the world to put a coordinated global research roadmap. Let us work together in science to actually not just take care of COVID, but perhaps be better when the next one comes. And this idea is very much based in let's not forget predict, let's not forget prevent, so that perhaps there won't be much to detect and to respond. So my point is some things have changed, some things haven't changed. We're very good in some of these areas, but perhaps when it comes to predict and a little perhaps to prevent, there is some to go. But some people have been working a lot on this. And I think Peter, who has done it in the known and unknown corners of the planet, can very well take us now forward into that. Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And I want to encourage people to start tapping in questions into the Q&A box, and we will, some of them Carlos will answer as I'm talking, and then we'll get to actually answering them live as we go through afterwards. So I want to just show a few slides and start to think about what could we be doing better in the future. I want to check, can you see my screen there, Carlos? Okay. All right, great. So here's why I think Carlos is right. We can't have business as usual where pandemics emerge and spread and then we all go into lockdown like we did in 1348 and hope for the best. That's not a good strategy. It seems to have happened with COVID-19, probably because COVID-19 spread so easily, much easier than we first thought. And this is really common for most emerging diseases. At the very early stages of emergence, people don't know what they are. They don't really understand the disease yet. And things happen that are unexpected. This is a screenshot from an app that we produced with Department of Homeland Security here in the US a few years ago called Flight Risk Tracker, FLIRT. You can look at it on the web, you can play with it, you can simulate where a virus would spread through passenger travel, through airlines. And this actually, when you click the passenger simulation, it has an algorithm that predicts not only direct flights, but then where people make connections to. And at the towards the third week of January, when Wuhan had just gone on to lockdown, this was the flight pattern that had been happening up till then. And we can see that actually COVID-19 had escaped out of China and spread to many parts of the world, the Middle East, Europe, and the US significantly, and seeded a lot of other outbreaks. So often we're too late, and that's the problem. You know, by the time we get to deal with this, we have no option but to go into lockdown. So what I'm proposing is we need a significant change, transformational change. We need to look at pandemics as a public health risk. And what we do with public health threats is we try and prevent them. We don't just wait for them to happen. So how do we do that? Well, we need to know what the next disease is going to be. And that's a big challenge. And I want to talk a little bit about how we do that. We call this the disease X. COVID-19 is a disease X. It was the unknown, X being the unknown in mathematical equations. We need to work with people at the places where diseases first emerge to reduce the risk of them emerging, to build better clinics and healthcare for those people who might be the first to get the pathogen that emerges. Most pandemics come from animals. Most of those come from wildlife. People who have a high interaction with wildlife, often in rural, remote areas, in developing countries, are the first to be hit by what then become pandemics, usually. I think that we can design vaccines and drugs that not just target the last known pathogen, but also future pathogens. It is possible to do that. It's going to take some clever science and investment, but it's beginning already. I'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, finally, the real One Health issue. How do we deal with the underlying causes of pandemics? Things like the wildlife trade, like deforestation, that our work has shown drive on a global scale emerging disease risk. So I'm going to start with the unknowns, the disease X. And I want to quote from the Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, who was widely criticized for this speech. He won a Foot in the Mouth award from a journalist association in the US. But actually, it's a very illuminating and clever comment. And it's hard to quote. There are known knowns. There are things that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know, we don't know. And he's right. And he was talking about terrorist threats. He was talking about how what we really need to do is predict terrorist threats. We need to listen to the rumors on the web of terrorist cells getting ready for an attack. The cells that we know about, the known cells, and the unknown attacks that they're designing, and also the cells we don't know about, the unknowns and the attacks they're starting. It has exact same implications for pandemics. Pandemics are caused by new viruses we don't know. They're often from viral groups. They could be related to viruses we do know, the known unknowns. And COVID-19 is one of those. It's related to SARS. We knew about SARS. We knew SARS came from bats in China, and we were on the ground there looking for other viruses. But we also know there are a wide diversity of viruses in wildlife. In fact, we were able to get a very, very rough estimate of the probable number of unknown viruses in wildlife by doing repeated sampling of animals. And what you can see here across the x-axis are the number of samples we took from two different species, a fruit bat in Bangladesh and macaques. And then the number of viruses on the y-axis that we discovered over per sample. And you find most viruses early in the sampling effort, the most common ones. There are some that are very rare that you never find. But from the shape of the curve, effectively, you can predict the ultimate number of unknown viruses. We estimate there are about 1.7 million in wildlife of the type that normally cause pandemics, mammals and water birds for flu. We expect about 650 to 840,000 of those are likely to infect people or able, but we don't know which ones. So we have to go out and find those if we truly want to design drugs and vaccines that will work against them. We know how much it will cost. It's expensive. And because you get most early on, you don't need to look for all of them. You can actually much more efficiently discover 71% of them for about $1.2 billion. It's a huge amount of money. But if you do that over a 10-year period, it becomes more affordable. And let's face it, pandemics cost a lot. This current pandemic is in the trillions of dollars of economic shock to our system. Past pandemics like SARS, which only affected 8,000 people, cost between $30 and $50 billion. They're extremely expensive. If we can reduce the number of cases by about 1%, we get a 9-to-1 return on investment for this expenditure. So I think it's worth it. I think we're going to have to do things differently, and this is one of them. We've actually launched a project called the Global Virome Project. There's an organization now. We're raising funds, and we're getting ready to go out and do that work. I hope you'll all join us in that. But we have begun to show that this approach can work. And this gets to all four of those proposed efforts, the transformational change. So this is a paper we put out a couple of days ago where we've sampled bats in China for the last few years and found about 780 new bat coronavirus sequences and tried to look at how they're related. On the left of the screen are the alpha coronaviruses. You can see the SARS cluster, and you can see the SARS coronavirus 2 cluster, the COVID cluster. And what we find is that bats carry a really high diversity of viruses. Within this group, we can look at the cell surface proteins and analyze whether these viruses are able to bind to human cells or not. So we can actually discover a lot of new viruses and then begin to triage them and say, which ones are likely to be able to infect people? If they're not, we're not as interested. We're not worried about them. If they are, let's look some more. When we put them into an animal model, do they cause a disease like SARS? If they do, that's important. Can we treat them with vaccines? If not, let's test drugs and vaccines against them. We know where these diseases will emerge in the future, roughly. We can't be completely accurate about this, but we know on a sort of a comparative basis from one place to another, which are the hotspots for emerging diseases. And these maps are, on the left are the hotspots for emerging diseases, and on the right is the predicted unknown diversity in bats in the region. And I'm focusing on Southeast Asia because I want to show that, you know, we've seen two viruses emerge out of China, but the whole region of Southeast Asia is a real hotspot for pandemics. We've taken some very small pilot studies of people and shown that 3% of people in Southwest Yunnan have antibodies to bat coronavirus. This was a couple of years ago before COVID-19. If that holds true across the region where Rhinolophus bats, the ones that carry SARS, live, we predict between 1 and 7 million people a year get infected by these viruses. So we can work with those communities and start to educate them and talk to them about changing behaviors. It's hard to do, but we need to do that. First of all, you need to find out what are the risky behaviors that could drive a new disease spilling over from bats. Things like eating bats, putting them into the wildlife trade, living near bat caves, going into bat caves, digging the feces, using it for medicine or for fertilizer. All of these things happen in Southeast Asia, and all of them are risky. And all of them are very traditional cultural practices and going to be hard to change. But working with communities over a period of time, we can do this. And what about vaccines? Someone asked the question already, how long will it take to get a vaccine to COVID? Well, the news is not great on vaccines. This is a list of vaccines that were designed and rolled out on a global scale over the past few years. And it takes a long time normally to produce, test, and scale up the production of vaccines. Usually more than a decade, usually many decades, from the discovery of the virus to the scaling up globally of an available vaccine. For COVID, I'll go back. For COVID, we're ramping that up incredibly rapidly and accelerating. Over 100 candidate vaccines, and probably the first they're already in clinical trials or just beginning, and will be, hopefully if they work, they'll be available next year. But that's if they work, and we don't know how effective they're going to be. And it's the same for drugs. It takes a long time to produce and test. So the future really should be better than this. And one thing that people have been trying to do is to say, can we design vaccines that work against all known strains of a virus or even potential future strains? So there's work that's been going on for some time to design a universal flu vaccine that affects every known strain of flu. Can we do this for coronaviruses? Well, I'm sure we could. We could start the work. It's not been done yet. I think there is talk about it, and maybe that will be one strategy. Maybe not all coronaviruses, but all of the alpha and beta coronaviruses from bats that we've discovered. Perhaps that could be the first step. We are already seeing this in drugs, and this is quite exciting. Using the sequences that we've produced on bat coronaviruses that not even infected people yet. They've been used by taking the spike proteins of those viruses, inserting them into another virus in the lab. It's possible to actually test drugs against the viruses that haven't even emerged. That's been done, and remdesivir, which is so far the only drug proven in clinical trials to be in any way effective against COVID-19, was tested against what they call pre-pandemic bat coronaviruses. The same with another experimental drug that is right now getting ready for clinical trials. So there is hope on that too. But I want to finish by talking about the underlying drivers. This is a picture of a palm oil plantation in Sabah, Malaysia, Borneo. And you can see what happens with palm oil is basically you clear cut forest, grow a very intensive monoculture crop that's incredibly profitable. Biodiversity is really lost in this process significantly. What happens is people move in to a pristine forest, clear cut the forest, and grow crop. They live there. They often hunt bushmeat. They're exposed to things like mosquitoes that transmit zoonotic malaria, leptospirosis, and we see a spike in health issues. We've calculated the economic cost of those diseases for Sabah. Just one disease, malaria, makes the production of palm oil in most places unprofitable if you calculate and include the future cost of those cases and controlling those cases. So we're really not doing a good job of our footprint on the ground, which drives pandemics globally. And if we think about it as an economic cost of the things we do on the planet, pandemics, then maybe we can do a better job of that. We're also looking at the wildlife trade, which is a significant driver of pandemics and is a very high risk for future pathogens. And we know COVID-19 seems to have some involvement with the wildlife trade in China. SARS-1, the original SARS, definitely did. The wildlife trade is a very old cultural issue in China and Southeast Asia. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people engage in this every year, with millions of animals, live animals, brought into markets and sold. It's very high risk, but it's not going to change overnight. And I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge in that how we're going to get this to be reduced in a place where this is something that's highly valued. And it's not going to happen by simply saying we'll ban it. The opportunity here is to use all of our One Health skills from social science, environmental studies, veterinary and medical science to understand the risk, work with communities and design alternatives and persuade people to use them. An opportunity that has to be taken. And I hope that many of you on the call today are either already working on these things or beginning to think about it. Let's do this together and beat the pandemic era. I want to thank some of the funders of our work and mention our journal EcoHealth, which publishes paper exactly on these issues. And then hand back to Carlos, and we're going to start answering questions live. Carlos,
Thank you very much, Peter. I guess we have already hit the first goal of today's webinar. We've engaged the audience and we have quite a few things popping up. I will try to go through and coordinate a little and ping pong some of these back and forth to Peter as well. Some are very related to some of the work that has just been mentioned, has been done in many of these areas like Southeast Asia. So we'll try to cover some of them. Perhaps we can take first, there have been 2 or 3 questions related to a hot topic. And I think concerning exactly the paper you just shown, Peter, about diversity of coronavirus in China, you can start actually by that one. And it's the old, well, not old, but very appropriate story. Is COVID-19 a lab accident? Are we talking of a chimeric virus? What is the real story? And I would say quickly no, but perhaps you, based especially on what you just shown, can take us a little further.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is pretty good evidence that it's not been manipulated. The genetic sequence from SARS coronavirus 2 shows nothing in it that's a signature of a virus that's been manipulated. And viruses that have been modified in the lab often have these typical signatures, which this doesn't. Secondly, there's no evidence that it was in the lab in the first place, or that it escaped from the lab. I mean, really, when you look at trying to understand where a virus came from, you're really going back to the scene of an accident or something like this and trying to decipher what happened from the mess that you've got. And what we do know is that there's this incredible interface between wildlife and livestock and people in China and Southeast Asia, and that allows viruses to trickle across every year, every week, every day. People are getting exposed. And there is really strong evidence that this originated from bats, which carry these viruses in the wild. There are some signatures in CoV-2, which are found in bats. And I think all of the evidence points to a natural origin and no evidence points to a lab origin at this point.
I'd like to share here also a question that is Southeast Asia is a hotspot for coronavirus, but what is the distribution elsewhere? For example, East Africa has more than 100 bat species. What does the corona diversity look like there, and how are these related to those known to be pathogenic to man? And perhaps before asking you also, Peter, to comment on the corona, it's important to remember that, again, pandemics or any type of disease is always the interaction between all these elements. You need to have the pathogen, you need to have the humans if it's going to spill into the humans. Very often you need to have hosts, reservoirs like wildlife animals. And the fact is that it is areas like Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, tropical Africa, the Amazon, where we still have abundant wildlife. Perhaps people will say, why isn't the Amazon perhaps such a hotspot? Well, there we're actually missing people. We don't have that many people in those areas yet, but it's the areas where these things, and it's also areas where more people are growing quicker, where deforestation is happening quicker. So it's in the areas where these elements are interacting closer and changing quicker that things might spill. But on the coronavirus in Africa, Peter, would you have something else to add?
Really interesting. I mean, the truth is, we don't know what the diversity of coronaviruses is in East Africa. There's been a little bit of work, and we know that if you look at MERS coronavirus, the chances are that that's bat origin coronavirus too. If you look at where is the big, and I worked with FAO, and Juan Lubroth is on the call here, who used to be at FAO. We looked at camel production sites around the world, and East Africa is a hotspot for camel production. It's a biodiversity hotspot for bats, and there are coronaviruses similar to MERS there. And it looks like that could be where MERS originated and then got into the camel population and is now endemic. But we've not done a deep dive on what coronaviruses are present. There are some that we've discovered through a project called PREDICT. And I think, Juan Lubroth actually made a comment on this issue of, well, the biodiversity of wildlife is actually all across the tropics. Why don't we seem to hear about as many diseases emerging in, for instance, Brazil, where there's incredible biodiversity of wildlife? And if you look at bats, we published a paper on predicted biodiversity of unknown viruses in different mammal groups. The big hotspot for bat unknown viral diversity is the Amazon. Yet we don't seem to see many pathogens emerge. And I think this goes to what Carlos was talking about, which is the human-wildlife interactions are either different there, the behaviors are different that we have, and our interactions with wildlife, or the population density and the encroachment into wildlife areas is different. Anybody who's been to rural South China, Southwest China knows that there are just villages with hundreds of people, cities with millions of people, very closely connected to wildlife and very traditional behaviors that put us at risk. So I think that there are, that's not to say in the future it could change, but right now, thankfully, we're not seeing those viruses emerge yet.
We have a few here more related to policy. I will save those for a little, but there is one here which I think is very addressed to one of Peter's slides from actually one of our commissioner colleagues, Eric, about simulation of virus discovery. I can read so that all the other people on the call will follow. The projection of virus discovery over time that Peter that you just presented assumes the number of viruses is static. So in 10 years, we could catch with them. But if new viruses are emerging in the hosts all the time, this might be like running on the treadmill, would it not? I guess the question is, how fast do we need to run on with the evolutionary treadmill? Eric is asking.
Well, thanks, Eric. That's a great analogy, actually. You're right. I mean, viruses are famously rapidly evolving. But what we find, if you look at SARS, for instance, the evolution of the coronavirus that caused SARS from the beginning of the outbreak in people to the end was pretty rapid. And SARS-CoV-2 is evolving in different, to form different geographic patterns right now. But when we go back to the same sites with bats, for instance, in China, and look for the coronaviruses related to SARS, we find the same viruses. The viral evolution seems to be moving at a slower pace. At least the consensus sequences we get are more stable in the natural reservoir host. And I guess that makes sense because there's less pressure for evolution in the host that they've already co-evolved with over millennia. But I think that what we really do need to get is a handle right now on roughly the clades of viruses that are available that could emerge into people in wildlife. And then we can start to get into the species of viruses and the quasi-species within that. And there will be some evolution over time. But I certainly think that we can tag viral clades that we don't have vaccine or drug readiness for, that we could start to do that. But good point.
Very good. They keep on popping, so I'm trying to follow up. But there is one here that I think we could spend 1 minute or two. And Abraham Alabi has a message from Liberia. Collective global effort at preventing and combating epidemics and pandemics seems to be faltering with individualism among nations. For instance, recent withdrawal of the US from the WHO in the midst of a pandemic. what needs to be done now and to redress this negative and dangerous trend and save the world by ensuring global unity, particularly caring for resource limit settings as pandemics do not recognize national or continental barriers. From my side, Abram, I would say that's straight to the point. And without going into political discussions on what country is doing, one would say that sometimes in war, you can regroup, but perhaps disperse is not the right option. Unfortunately, in the middle of a crisis, it might also not be the easiest time to come up with interesting and new ways to avoid these issues. So I do understand a lot of the countries are struggling with collaboration across borders when they have burning problems within their own areas. So I would say that what we do need to focus is to, hopefully on not so long from today, we will get through this COVID-19 pandemic. But we do need to ensure that we develop the strategy, the tools, the platforms for working together during peacetime, so that we do not, again, face a situation where we all turn our backs to each other. That said, I would say that you highlighted, of course, a sad example, but we have very good examples of collaboration across continents and of people bridging out to ensure that we help each other, especially those in need. Peter, you had something to add on that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm here in the US, and you talk about the US withdrawal from WHO. Don't be fooled by the bluster and rhetoric coming out of the White House right now in the US. We have a president who is, right now today, we've got protesters on the streets of police violence. We've got a president who didn't do a great job personally, and his administration didn't do a great job of listening to science and following science to deal with an outbreak. We have a population that's been on lockdown, and the president is making a case that the virus came from China, so China's to blame, that WHO did a bad job, so we're going to defund them. This is bluster, and it probably will pass, even if President Trump gets re-elected, because at some point we need to grow our economy, we need to link back into to our globalized network of economic partners. But I do think there's an opportunity here. First of all, for us to recognize that blaming people or animals in an outbreak is a mistake. Saying that bats are the problem is a mistake. Saying that this country had an outbreak is a mistake. Outbreaks will happen, and they will happen and spread. And they're going to spread to the richer countries because we travel the most. They emerge here too. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as scientists, we have a really good opportunity to do our bit for diplomacy. We all are going to find ourselves working with countries where our governments aren't speaking very well together, but we're working with individual scientists. That's diplomacy. We have an opportunity to show off how valuable that is and act as an example and leadership for our politicians, who often go to the lowest common denominator when they try to deal with these issues. So let's lead by example. Back to you, Carlos.
Picking in what you just said about diplomacy, I see here a question about whether the politics will influence scientific research, since there are too many different viral source theories. What are the known knowns in the topic of pandemics? Can we still believe in research? And here I would actually answer about, well, do politics influence research? Yes, I guess we can always say they do, if nothing else, by the power they have to fund and to channel money into different topics. But I would turn this question the other way around. Perhaps the goal will be to have more and more science influence politics. And it's important to think that all of us scientists, we are not doing science for politicians, we're doing science for society, to answer the needs of a global society. And usually politicians tend to listen to society, if not daily, every 4 years when they get elected, I would joke about. So bringing society with us, helping society understand that this is a topic that needs to be investing, we need to invest time and invest funds here. Perhaps we will also be able to influence politics and not just the other way around.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would add to that. But before the pandemic, when we see a scientist on TV, you know, talking to camera and hyping up the issue, being dramatic about something, maybe getting some of the facts wrong or making it too simplistic, scientists are often very critical of those people. But we need those people. We need the scientists that talk to the media. We need the reporters that are excited by science to get our story across. I think one of the problems we've got right now is that science is so complicated. Epidemiology is so ridiculously complicated. Virology especially is a real problem because these are molecular biological techniques that the average person in the public has no exposure to in their daily life. So we really need to get people in our society to understand why we do these things, to discover viruses and to stop them emerging. Otherwise, when we really need them to support the work, it's not going to be there. So I'm looking forward to finding those champions for the public interpretation of science. Maybe on the call today, we have to get out there and explain to people why this work is important. You can never do enough of that.
I'm trying to browse through some of these questions. Some of them perhaps we can give a very short answer. There was one here talking a little about farmed raccoons and farmed minks and raccoon dogs in China. I mean, trying to be a little quick on some of these, I suppose, so that we cover the more the merrier. There is a lot of talk of intermediate hosts. We've run through the snake, the pangolin, the farm mink, the raccoon dogs, and without being actively doing research in China, I would say probably one of these, who knows several of these. The point is, number one, we do need more data. We do need more information to make correct assessments. And perhaps what we do need is the question was actually very well put, intensively farmed mink. So the problem might not be the species, it might actually be the husbandry we do of this species, or that perhaps we shouldn't be doing about this species. So that would be my question. Do you have perhaps a few here directly for you, Peter, related to remdesivir and flavipiravir being a better treatment? Do you want to cover these ones, perhaps?
Well, I mean, we'll know how good they are when they've undergone really gold standard prospective clinical trials, and that's what we need to do. And I think that even remdesivir, the clinical trial that I mentioned, isn't, you know, it is a small clinical trial, and I think it was retrospective. But anyway, we need to, it wasn't randomized, I think that's correct. But we really do need to test these drugs and vaccines carefully before we start widespread use. I'm sure there will be others. And I think that ultimately, you know, remdesivir reduced the time of infection or time of hospitalization by 30%. It's a start, and I think that maybe a group of drugs used together, 2 or 3 of these new drugs used together, might be one of the solutions for people who are seriously ill with COVID-19. But really, we're not going to get society back to normal until we get a vaccine, and that's where our efforts really need to be rapid and done well. And I think, you know, I have confidence we're going to get there. I'm just not sure which one or how successful it's going to be. In other words, will we need regular boosters? What percentage of people will it make immune to reinfection? And those are very important things.
I have another one here that I can also try to share some thoughts. A lot of risk behavior is responsible for the occurrence of diseases. How can we bring back the balance in nature to minimize interference with nature, particularly destruction of wildlife habitats? Well, I'd say to the person asking, you're right on it. Avoiding destruction of wildlife habitats is already a step on the right direction. And as I try to show in this figure, interaction between humans, wildlife, and animals for that matter, and the environment will always continue to happen. They've been happening all the time. But we are responsible as humans and society for some of the quickest changes we've done here. So wildlife habitat preservation, we've talked many times in the last 3 months about markets and trade of wildlife. These are specific measures that just as much as, for example, predict. These are prevention of pandemics, and they need to be, perhaps, I would add to that question, dealt not just on a national level, but a true international movement towards here. And there have been some attempts to do this. And I mean, Juan is joining us here. He was at FAO together with OIE. They have tried to push for this global move to protect these interactions. But it is a tricky topic when you go from top to national level. There is one here, Peter, that you've worked out in China, so I would perhaps save this one here for you. Public health interventions, including sanitizing booths, are being used in China, since to a greater extent they have controlled COVID. Are there recommendations to extend this to other countries along with other non-pharmaceutical interventions? Two, based on the origin of COVID, which is bats, we need to do laboratory work from the source, get the trend across different continents, which will help in vaccine development and control measures. So is what happened in China, can we do some of the same, and how can we go deeper in there, in knowledge on the origin?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's kind of interesting really that what happened is we all saw China suffering from this outbreak early on. You know, a lot of us felt, well, hopefully it won't spread. And let's hope China can get through this. But when we look back now, here in the US particularly, China did a pretty good job actually of controlling it by some very severe lockdown measures. People were locked in their apartments essentially and forced to stay in for a long period of time. Whereas in some countries, it doesn't work as easily as that. So there are many things we can pick up from how China managed the outbreak. There are many ways we can look to what China's doing now to open up after the outbreak. Here in the US, we're opening up in a different way. We've got different states opening up faster than others. We've got different groups of the population just going all out for COVID's over, let's just get back to business as normal. And we've got other people who are continue to be on lockdown, including here in New York City. So I think that what we've got to learn is everything we can from every country that's been through this, but they're not always going to work. The measures aren't always going to work because different societies have different societal norms, and if you push too far, the backlash can be particularly damaging on things like social distancing programs. I think we're going to have a long, difficult opening up in many countries after the outbreak. And let's not forget that in many countries, the outbreak is peaking right now. I'm thinking about Brazil, for instance. And in many developing countries, we don't know how severe the outbreak is because the testing isn't up to the rate of some of the richer countries around the world. So this virus is going to be here causing big problems for another significant period of time, probably a year of real difficult times for many countries. Let's learn everything we can from China and everything we can from countries that didn't do a good job of controlling the vaccine. And I look to Norway as one of the countries, Carlos, that did do a good job. I think I know the Swedish situation very well. You have two contrasting countries, closely related, but have a different approach. One, Norway, that took a good lockdown approach, followed the China model and the social distancing, and Sweden that tried to wing it through a different strategy. And now we can see the cases per capita are markedly different, much more severe in Sweden than in Norway. So there are real examples of where this doesn't work. What do you think?
Yeah, that's it is a highly debatable topic here in Scandinavia, of course. I suppose we need to let measures follow its course and evaluate them, but it is indeed a good example of, despite an international coordination on this response, we are observing national choices and national preferences that, of course, all countries are different, but that will allow us to think ahead, I suppose. Both Norway and Sweden will find the defaults and improvements in their choices. And I hope, as you mentioned, that we can learn something out of it. I take a very quick chance here to answer one question that has come through. We have still 5 minutes to go. This one perhaps quickly. Martin from Norway asked me about the comment on the possible links between COVID-19 and antimicrobial resistance. And This has also been a topic now brought up several times, particularly perhaps at least in Europe. Of course, we know that many of these viral infections that very quickly debilitate the human health are prone to secondary infections. That is, of course, a typical situation. With the virus, you'll get a bacteria, you'll get a secondary infection. Anything that makes a difficult scenario even more complicated, of course, has an impact. So I would, of course, agree that antimicrobial resistance, the lack of efficient therapeutics mechanisms to fight secondary infection that may come along with COVID are a worrying factor to consider here. I would be careful to go further on the links between the two of them and how one might push the other one further. But of course, if you have COVID and on top of that you get a nasty bacterial infection and no antibiotic works, if you have a problem, you have a big problem. I wonder, Dave, Peter, here there are two topics. We still have a lot of questions.
I want to just answer this one on communication.
Yeah, that was, I would say, that two here on risk communication and one last on scientific information.
First of all, I want to say it's quite a funny and ironic that one of the people who wrote about communication and conspiracies is called Anonymous, like the mystery person who is on social media. But I'm joking. Look, absolutely correct. Flawed risk communication. Communicating science is usually difficult and can be very boring to the public. But in a pandemic, it's absolutely critical that politicians, trusted voices, are out there talking confidently about the scientific issues. There are some areas where it's been done well and some areas where it's been done badly. Now, I'm here in the US. We know the examples of where it's been done badly, unfortunately by our president and our administration, where the communication early on was to try and dismiss the outbreak, and then all the way through has been confusing with mixed messages. Should we wear a mask? We hear the scientists say yes. We hear the president say, I'm not going to bother. Unfortunately, leadership in an outbreak involves open, transparent communication, often communicating with the public regularly, often, and accurately, the good and the bad. Our state governor here in New York State has been extremely good with daily briefings to the public, all the ugliness of the caseloads revealed, so we know that he's being honest with us and we can trust that information. That means we'll follow the advice of those politicians who do that. It's absolutely critical. Now we're in the 21st century with social media, and if you go online, there is every possible answer to a question. There are very, very well-designed, well-made videos about how this drug works, this vaccine doesn't, or the virus came from here or there. Mm-hmm. Filtering that is very difficult for anybody. Filtering it and for the public for very complicated scientific issues is even harder. Communication is key. We need to communicate to our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, people in the street. Tell them you're a scientist. Tell them what you think about a theory. Even if it's not your area of expertise, you know more than most people because you work generally in this area. So you have a right to be an armchair epidemiologist, and everybody else is. Let's have some real epidemiologists here on the call actually talking to them and saying, actually, you may be a bit wrong on that. And this is what we think as scientists. But I hope you're all doing that. I think it's absolutely critical, and it will be critical forever on this issue. Over.
Yeah. So to that, I mean, very little to add. I will just, there was here, how can we scientists make sure that our politicians will hear? I would actually say, talk to the politicians, that's great, but talk to your neighbor. And without advertising for Google, I would use my slide to say, keep Googling for pandemic. Don't let, once you get vaccinated, because that time will come, hopefully, just don't go idle, because we will get another one later and we would really not like to repeat it. We have 1 minute left and there were still several questions here. I have one here that is specifically addressed to Peter. I will keep that one almost to the end. A very quick one here that I would just quickly say, can whole genome sequencing reveal the animal species chain and whether farming has been involved at any point? I would tell you, Mary, probably all information we can gather on the epidemiology and on transmission and on case reports will give us a much better picture. Some of these viruses are changing in a few nucleotides, so of course finding all the pieces along the road will allow us to get a much better idea of what is happening. But what I think me and Peter tried to tell is that we could be doing that before it hits us this hard. We can be looking at these little pieces of information and finding where it is already. Peter, there are here one question actually coming from Karin Lagerson, and she mentioned a little about how is EcoHealth going to move forward when the US is cutting right and left on anything that is research on these topics?
Yeah, it's really difficult when your funding is cut to work on an issue. But we're going to move forwards. Our mission as an organization is to understand the origins of pandemics and try and prevent them. We've got a lot of work to do. We laid out on the talk today some of the things we need to be doing. We're going to be doing them. We're going to be working in China as soon as possible. The real reason we're not there right now is because we're still on lockdown. There are other sources of funding we will seek. There are other sources of funding we've got, and we will be out there. And, you know, you've not heard the last about this issue. The bigger question here is, should politicians interfere with the democratic process and the very good process of reviewing and funding science grants? The answer, of course, is no. The grant funding for science needs to be judged by scientists and the funding agencies, not by politicians who are concerned about what is effectively a conspiracy theory. Don't take it from me, take it from 77 Nobel laureates who spoke out about this issue. This is not about our grant. We're going to carry on our work. This is about the bigger issue of the freedom to do science internationally with leading scientists from countries like China. We need that. Viruses emerge in other countries. We all need to be on the ground working with our collaborators there to find out why and to stop it. If we don't do that, we're all at risk.
I agree. So with this, as I said, I have one last question because it takes 5 seconds to answer. There were a few here, I have to say, about development of universal vaccines that we could, of course, spend a lot of time, but we're trying to keep in time with the organizers so they don't just throw us out. But I would end with actually the first question that came through the open questions here from Michael Promentila in the Philippines, asking if EcoHealth and One Health, what differs and how this differs in addressing future pandemics. And I would say to Michael, of course, we have different words: EcoHealth, One Health, planetary health, our health, Earth health. But the point is, while they might differ a little in how they approach the topic, at the core, the message is always the same. Let us look to problems that hit humans, hit animals, hit the environment together. Let us merge not just species, but disciplines, society, social disciplines, economic disciplines, health disciplines, and let us work in an integrated way so that one problem that actually affects us all is dealt by everyone. Peter, any last word before we say thank you to everyone?
Well, I'm just responding here to a brilliant question about whether government should focus on public health or economies. Well, we have to focus on both. And any government that thinks that the economy is the only important thing is missing the point. When thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people die and overwhelm our hospitals, it crushes our economies. And that's the key issue. Let's hope we can all stay safe out there, and let's hope COVID-19 passes very quickly from our countries and that a vaccine comes through. But as Carlos said, let us not forget about this. In 2 years, 5 years, we need to be doubling down on this new effort to prevent pandemics. And I'm sure we will. I'm sure that people will try and forget about it. We need to remind them every single day. Thanks for listening. Great to see you all.
So from my side as well, we have had more than 200 people, I think, that have registered. So we have now at least 200 more One Health supporters, I hope. And if we have helped towards that mission, I think we have achieved the goals for today. So from my side, I'd like also to thank the Lancet Commission for organizing this webinar and for inviting us. And thanks, Peter, for taking up the challenge to join me here as well across the ocean on this topic. So as Peter said, stay safe, and we will see each other soon, hopefully during peacetime, working to avoid pandemics. Thanks for today.